Hi there, my name is Hannah Jones, and I'm going to present my final project. So I'll start by starting my backend. And while that's loading, I'll outline what I have planned. So I'll first go over my UI and functionality, then dive into my front-end code, and finally round out by talking about my backend code. So that has started. I'll go ahead and start my React app. Okay. And this will start on the login page. I'll first log in as admin and then as user to show you the difference in authorization. The idea for my application was to create a platform where users could review books and also add those books to collections. So here it opens on our profile page. We can see all the collections for this user. We can favorite collections. And we can also sort collections by alphabetical ascending or descending. We can also create a new book collection by entering at least a name and then also a description, and we can set favorite and private for that collection. Let's go into a collection and we can see all the books in a collection. We can toggle our privacy. And right here we have our collection name, who created it, and a little description. We can edit the collection because we do own this collection and we are in fact admins, so we can edit any collection. All right. We can also remove books from the collection and we can sort as well by title, author, or genre. So let's go into a book. Here we see the book information. We are admin, so we are able to edit this book. I do want to clarify that my groupings of items are the collections, so each user can have a collection and edit the collection. However, the items that each user creates, edits, and deletes are actually the reviews. The admins are the only ones who have permission to create and edit books. This was very intentional. I wanted books to be restricted to admin creation to maintain consistency across the application. I thought if users could create their own book, there would be several different versions of the same book, and it would be very hard for users to locate reviews. By restricting it, all the reviews will always be tied to one book, so users will know exactly where to go to look at all the reviews for a specific book. I can add a book to a collection. I am admin, so I can add it to my own collections and then also other users' collections. I can create a new review and I can edit reviews for all users again because I am admin. So I'll pull up my specific review. I can click back to the book and I can update the review as well. You'll notice that this information persists on refresh and it does the same for book and also profile. Okay, let's switch over to search. So we can search by book or collection. The user input changes based on which one we would like to search by. We can search for all books and we can also narrow our search. And we can search by like comparison for any field in both book and collection. We can sort again. You'll notice that the search data persists even if we go between different pages. And we can select specific books. We can also select collections from this page, both ours and others. We're admin right now, so we can see everyone's, but users can only see public as well as their own. Because I am admin, I have the create book page here. Okay, I'm going to switch over to user real quick just to show you some of the different functionality. So I still have my collections that I can click into. However, you'll notice that I do not have the option to edit a book because I am not admin. I also cannot see the private review of another user. And you'll notice I cannot edit reviews of other users. Similarly, I do not have the ability to create a book. All right, now I'm going to switch over to my front-end code to explain the organization. So I have folders based on each page. I want to note that this is based on the visual page that the user would see. So for example, on the book page, we have add to collection, we have create a review, we have book manager, which is editing the book. So even though this is the book page, we do have functionality tied to collection and also review because that's what the user would be able to interact with on that specific page. It's the same for collection and profile. I want to dive into profile to talk about my logging component because it leads into my auth context, and I want to highlight my auth context and data context to explain the organization of my app and some of the choices I made. So when a user logs in, it sets the token that they receive from login in local storage and auth context, which is a context used across all components across the entire application. I acknowledge that setting a token in local storage can leave an application open and vulnerable to XSS attacks. I wanted to say I acknowledge it. For the scope of the project, I still chose to put it in local storage based on the resources available to me. Okay, I want to dive into my auth context to show that the token is stored here and is used across all components. So all components can use that token to make requests to my backend. After a token is set, the user component gets the user and role information and sets that in my auth context as well. So that can be used for verification purposes across the app. I also have a data provider. I chose to separate this from the auth provider because to me they serve two different purposes. The auth provider was for authentication purposes versus my data provider, which served as a way to pass information between components. So for example, um, in my search, results, when a book is clicked on, the auth context, or excuse me, the data context is used to help load the book page and ensure that the URL and options are stored in local storage. So when the book page is refreshed, that data appears again and persists. So that is why I have two different contexts. I also want to acknowledge that my search component looks very similar to my data context. However, I chose to separate them so that my search information would persist when switching between different pages. If I had combined it with the data provider, that would not have been possible. I needed to set separate storage. I needed to set the search URL separate in storage from the URL in the data provider. And I chose to keep it in the search component as it would only be necessary for user input and search results to access this. Okay, I'm going to dive more in depth to my collection, specifically my collection books table component, but I wanted to start in my collection component. In my collection component, when the collection data is loaded, it uses a useEffect hook to set a URL to get all my books in my collection. These URL and options is passed to my collection books table component, which will use it to load the data specifically for the table. The collection ID and username of the logged in user is also passed to that component as a prop. Okay, I'm going to I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to the bottom, and you can see that this component's function is to load the table and handle user interactions within this table. So the table headers and table data are both loaded dynamically. So the table will update even if extra headers are added to books, for example. And I'm just going to go over each of the clicks. I think that's the best way to move through this component and explain it. So my first click is on headers. It handles sort. So I have a use sort hook that accepts an array of data and returns a new sorted array of data based on the order, but based on the key and the order. You can see my next click is on a row. So this would be clicking on a book. And what this would do is use the use load page to load a book page. So I went up ahead and brought up the use load page hook. This hook returns a handle load function that is used upon click when a book row is clicked. And basically, it uses the data context to update local storage and then pass that URL and options information to data context to load the book page. It also navigates to that page. I chose to use this as a hook because this logic is repeated across multiple components, and I wanted to prevent duplication. Finally, back in my books table, the last click is my remove book. So this is for removing a book from a collection. And you can see that this is only rendered on the page if the logged in user has an admin role, or if the user of the collection, so the collection owner, matches the logged in user. On click, this uses a handle request function that comes from the create request hook, which returns that function along with data from a fetch request. And basically, this dynamically creates a request, dynamically creates the information to be passed into use fetch. So the the um, the URL, the options, and that includes the object being passed in for post and put request. So that removes a book from a collection. When that remove book data message comes back that the book has indeed been removed, use effect uses a set refresh setter from the data context to refresh the page. So the page will update and the book removed will no longer show in the collections table. Before I move into my back end, I want to go over challenges I faced when building my front end. A theme of the challenges I faced was stale data persisting unnecessarily. For example, this error message persisted even when my data came through successfully and I knew my request was successful. I solved this by tracking the error data URL across several components from my current component collections books table to my use fetch component, my data provider component to solve this issue. It ended up being a really simple fix. Just doing a quick check that the collection ID existed before setting the URL, so it wasn't being set with undefined. A larger issue I had along a similar thread was that my collection books table was populating with stale data. It was populating with the books from a previous collection viewed instead of the current collection viewed. I ended up figuring it out, and it was because I was using a use URL builder hook, which is really successfully used in my user input component. However, it was unsuccessfully being used in my data provider component. It did not work in this the way I had it written, and I decided to refactor this component to just use URL and option setters, and it works much better throughout my application. Okay, switching over to the backend, you can see that we have controllers for my HTTP request. It handles incoming request and delegates the work. I also have my DAOs to talk to the database. I ended up choosing to have a DAO per table. I also have my models, which act as my object builders. They also are used as object filters to pass information from my controllers to my DAOs. And I'll go ahead and dive into my collection controller. Briefly, I really want to go over my collection DAO, but this is a good place to start. So I am using pre-authorized permit all because I do want all users to be able to access and create and edit collection information. However, I'm using a helper function at the bottom to check if a logged in user is an admin or not. This uses security context, specifically the authentication object inside of security context, which holds the principal and authorities. Um, Basically, I'm checking to see if the login user has the admin authority. I chose to use this helper function instead of solely using annotations because I wanted to get very specific inside of methods of which parts of methods allowed authorization. So you can see here this get collections accepts several different request parameters, and it uses a collection object as a filter object to pass to our DAO. So if the request parameter name exists, the username exists, if those are being searched for, it sets them onto our collection object. It also checks to see if the logged in user is an admin or not. I, again, don't want to go completely through my collection controller. I'd prefer to concentrate on my collection DAO, so I'll switch over to there. Starting at the top, I am injecting my data source into my DAO. I am creating a new JDBC template, which will use data source to basically talk to the database. I have a setter here to set the JDBC template. This is for my test. For my test, I chose to mock out the JDBC template. I know that one option is to create a mock database. However, I saw different information online doing research and concluded that a mock database could count as an integration test. And because in this assignment we were focusing on unit testing, I chose to mock out the JDBC template. Okay, moving on. For my get collections method, I chose to use a query builder. I'll jump into the query builder real quick. I do want to focus on the DAO, but just to go over it, I'm using different arrays, and the query builder is accepting an array and it is using method chaining, so it's returning the instance of the query builder. So multiple methods can be called on this query builder. I'm going down to the bottom just to explain that I use a prepared statement creator. So I'm returning a prepared statement creator to the DAO. And I use a string builder to create the first part of to append several parts of the SQL query to create the full query. And then I use the prepared statement creator to add the values. I chose not to add the values as part of the string builder because doing so could potentially leave my database open to SQL SQL injection. So I'm returning a prepared statement creator, which will be used by my DAO. I chose to use a query builder because I wanted to be able to build my SQL queries super dynamically in this DAO, as well as my book DAO and my review DAO. If I had not done this, I would have had to do several different methods. For example, a method for collections, a method for collections based on the name, collections based on the username, collections based on both the name and the username. And that seemed very repetitive. I wanted to challenge myself to reduce the duplication and create a query builder. So in this specific method, I'm adding um, where statements and my values based on the collection object that was passed in. I'm also creating my order by clause and order by values. So that way it searches specifically by the condition, or excuse me, sorry, specifically by the exact value and then the value when it matches at the start of the word. I'm also finally um, having an order by statement so that if any collections belong to the user, those will be returned first after this order by clause is met. I also use um, my admin check so that if the logged in user is not an admin, it will return the collections that are either public or private and belong to that specific user. I use a mapper. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom real quick just to go over my mapper. So I use a result set, which has getter methods for returning column values from a specific row from a database table, and my collection constructor to create a new collection. I'll now go through the rest of my DAO. So I have get collection by ID. This gets a specific collection by the ID. I chose to separate this from my larger get collections method because they served two different purposes. This is more for queries while and searches within the app versus this method is used throughout the DAO itself and in the application to find one specific method, for example, or one specific collection, for example, a collection page. I have a create collection, which uses a prepared statement creator. I chose to use this so I can use the generated key holder, an implementation of key holder to get the primary key created, which in this case would be the collection ID. So that way I can use my get collection by ID method and return the collection created. I have an update and delete collection method as well. A challenge I faced when building my backend was really about the design. I struggled when it came to a join query between the book table and book collections table. I wasn't sure whether to include this in my collection DAO and my book DAO. Eventually, I decided to separate it out into its own DAO because for me, it served a different purpose to get the books specifically in a collection. The downside is that I did end up repeating my map to book mapper that is used in my book DAO. This was a big decision for me design-wise because I really wasn't sure what the best practice was. Eventually, I went with this just to make everything clean and to keep really my tasks straight. And that is all. Thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed making this, and I hope you enjoyed seeing my project.